when the people making decisions about D&D are not really D&D gamers. Things get complicated.
Welcome to the Red Caps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on about old school games. I am back from vacation, and in today's episode, I'm going to sit down with Ben Riggs, the author of the D&D history book, Slaying the Dragon, A Secret History of Dungeons & Dragons. It's a book that tells the story of TSR basically from the time of Gygax's exit until TSR is finally gone and Wizards of the Coast has acquired them. It was a lot of fun chatting with Ben. It was interesting having a conversation with an author that I had just finished. We had this conversation only a couple of weeks after I finished listening to his book on audiobook. And of course, his audiobook is done by somebody other than himself. So it was odd listening to a book that was all in first person and then talking to that same person and it being a different voice. It was an interesting experience. But we had a lot of fun chatting. There's a couple of technical glitches in the interview, a couple points where Ben's audio and video kind of cut out during there. But just bear with it. It will flow right through. There are only momentary interruptions. But stay with it. It's a really fun chat, and I hope you enjoy. So, since no mortal can outrun a red cap, I suggest you sit back, listen, and enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, I am joined by Ben Riggs, the author of Slaying the Dragon, A Secret History of Dungeons & Dragons. How you doing today?
I'm glad to be here, that's for sure.
I finished your book a couple weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I listened to the audiobook version, which was fantastic. For anybody who has not read the book, though, the name does kind of give a pretty good indication what it's all about. But what's your elevator pitch for what the book is?
I would tell you it is about the rise and fall of TSR and the management decisions that led to its death. And it's a story that, if you lived through the 90s, you think you know. And then I went and started asking questions, and I'm like, I had no idea. I didn't know this story at all. I thought I knew exactly what happened, and I did not. And that led to the writing of the book.
Yeah, it was really interesting to me. Also, the shift of what I thought the narrative was for that versus what it ended up being from your book. Like I said, I listened to the audiobook. Sean Patrick Hopkins did the narration on it. So but before I went to sit down and talk with you, all I had was his voice in a first person point of view from you going on. So I was worried it was going to be a big shock going from listening to you speak through his voice to coming and talking to you here. But with the whole publishing of a book and going for the audiobook and everything, what was that process like for you? Is that do you get a say in who narrates the book? Did you have to have auditions and you got to pick them, or did your publisher go, "This is who's doing it. Have fun"?
They clearly like to let us think that we have some sort of input and control over the production process. They were like, "What would you like on the cover?" I'm like, agonized for a week. Here are 3 suggestions, and of course, none of them came to fruition. That's fine. They gave me 2 voice actors to choose from, and again, they were both quite good. But the other gentleman was an Australian whose American accent was a California accent. And I'm like, I can't have a California accent in a Wisconsin story. It's just not going to fly. So I went with Sean, the gentleman that you heard. So at least that was the audiobook process. Do you want the nittier, grittier production story?
Sure. So I'm always interested to hear how this works. This is a part of I read a lot of books, or actually I should say I listen to a lot of books now because I do much more than via audio. But I never know what the other side of that is. So I'm interested in hearing that, of course.
I keep saying it was 17 years of failure before I got my first book published. I think that's probably pretty accurate. It was probably 17 years ago that I really started taking writing seriously and wrote my first novel and tried to get it published. After about 12 years of failing at that, I tried nonfiction, and I wrote for Geek and Sundry for a few years. Pardon me. That led to this book. Um, because Geek and Sundry was like, someone should write a story about how Wizards of the Coast didn't always make D&D. And I'm like, well, I'm the guy in Wisconsin. Let me do it. And they did. And again, the story I started to get from people was not the story I thought. There uh, bad contract deals, a lot of self-inflicted wounds, kind of wasting money was not what I was expecting to hear. So I was like, okay, my editor wouldn't let me get it all in my article for Geek and Sundry. So I'm like, I'll write a 10,000 word PDF and I will kickstart that. Well, that 10,000 word PDF grew until it was 100,000 words. And at that point, I was encouraged by friends in the industry to try and get it published by a major publisher. And I'm like, I just can't see it. Like, I can't imagine a major publisher agreeing to publish this. It just seems too niche. So then there were 2 years of rejections from agents. And at the end of that time, I'm like, whatever. I'll either self-publish it or a gaming company will publish it, and that's how it'll get out there. It'll be fine. That's what I was thinking. Then Andrews McMeel, which recently divested itself of all role-playing game publishing, expressed interest. And I was like, extreme interest. Like, they sent me a contract. And I'm like, look, whatever I need an agent for, I think I just did 90% of the work. I've got an offer on the table. I just need an agent to let me know if this contract is terrible. You take whatever cut you get of this choice. This is money on the table. And it was still like another week before I could get an agent. I actually had a friend's agent agree to talk to me and tell me over the course of 45 minutes why he would not represent me, even with an offer on the table. So I finally got an agent, and then Andrews McMeel withdrew their offer.
Oh,
But I right before that point, I was like, am I cursed? Do I smell? Like, what is it? Like, who do you have to bribe to get a literary agent in this world? And my agent is now Susan Velasquez of the Jabberwocky Literary Agency, and I'm pleased to death with her. And it was about 3 months after this that COVID hit, and I was like, oh, okay, who knows what's going to happen now? I'm glad I have an agent, but with COVID going on, is there any chance that this thing is actually going to sell? And then in August of 2020, my agent got us a meeting with St. Martin's Press, which is owned by Macmillan. And Peter Wolverton, an editor there, was like, this is exactly the kind of book we're looking for. We're looking for something to tap into the D&D market because we think it's growing. And my book was it. And 2 years of editing later, it came out. But, I don't know if people find that interesting or not. But I feel like so many times... Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, so what do you think your total time from Geek and Sundry saying, hey, somebody should write this history, and you start into your research until you get your first proof in your hand, which I assume must be really awesome whenever you get that first proof from the publisher of your book. What do you think the timeline of that was?
I'm going to say 4 years. If you let me do a little clicking, I can find out right now.
So 4 years, that's actually shorter than what I would have thought, because I hear of people who are writing novels or going down that route, and they might be 4 years just on getting and that's probably partially due to a motivation or a procrastination or a writer's block type scenario, but just getting through the initial first draft of it can take that long.
I'll tell you, I would have thought it was longer, actually. Like, I think I usually tell people 5 years, but now that we're sitting here and talking about it, I'm pretty sure it was the autumn of 2017 that I was assigned that article, and the book came out in July of 2022. So it'd be just a little under 5 years total from starting to publication. unless I'm misremembering and I started in 2016, but I'm pretty sure it was 2017 that I got assigned the article. It was like usually I could write a novel in a year and then edit it in another 6 months and then start sending it out. So it was like an 18-month turnaround for a novel. And it was like twice as long to get a manuscript on this. So it felt like a long time to me.
So the story of the book, like you said, is the rise and fall of TSR, and the story that we thought we knew but we didn't really know. And often that story is, especially, so the podcast and the background that I'm coming into this from is from like an old school gaming. I traditionally play games that are more from the TSR era. That style of gaming is what I'm into. And the common thought process, or the common story that gets told, is of the hero, Saint Gary of Gygax, and the evil villain Lorraine Williams, who destroyed everything, with other cast of characters all mixed in around there. And that's kind of the story that's always told. But whenever you read through the book, as well as, there's several other great D&D history books out there as well, that folks should be looking at. But when you're looking at this particular story of this timeline, you kind of get a different view of both of those characters. And in your book, the supporting cast definitely gets elevated up to being the main talking points in there. But the two people that get often talked about, Gary gets laid out for what he honestly is, which is kind of an unreliable narrator most of the time, a person who's there's a different Gary from the early 70s to the 80s to later on as time goes on. And Lorraine Williams, the evil witch hat that she may be wearing isn't necessarily always firmly on that head. Is there, if you had to sum it up really short in terms of, what somebody's perception of this might be versus what the perceived reality, or what the reality is that you've seen from it, where does it change? Like, what was the biggest change for you, I guess?
I would say it's the change from myth to reality, perhaps, because it's very easy to tell the story of like Gary was good, Lorraine Williams was bad, and Lorraine, because she was bad, stole the company from Gary, who was good, and she drove it into the ground. Again, I would say I take a more nuanced view. I also have the advantage of writing after a lot of people already did kind of the definitive work on Gary Gygax. So, like the Lorraine Williams era is kind of mine. No one yet is really in those waters with me. But there are numerous excellent historians working on Gary. And the picture that emerges from them, especially John Peterson, is of a brilliant but Machiavellian and deeply insecure man. He wants to be in charge, he wants to have control, and he made a really good game. But despite what he said, it does not mean he is a good businessman. And in his telling later on in life, he's like, my partners screwed me, essentially. And yet, if you go back and look, he clearly knew everything his partners were doing, because he talked about it in the Wall Street Journal. If he thought what they were doing was dumb, why didn't he have someone else take that interview? So again, Gary late in life would have said his partners messed up TSR, which allowed Lorraine Williams to steal it from him in backroom shenanigans. In truth, he certainly knew about most of the bad things and dumb things going on at TSR. He had a number of bad and dumb things that he himself was responsible for, like renting an unnecessarily large and expensive mansion in the Hollywood Hills. Like, fine if you're going to go west and try and break into the mainstream media, but get a cheap place. You don't need to rent a mansion where you can see both the ocean and the mountains. Again, he painted Lorraine Williams as both stupid and yet smart enough to steal the company from him. And the truth is, Lorraine Williams was able to buy a multi-million-dollar company for probably something like, $500,000, $250,000. John Peterson again has the exact number in Game Wizards, but the reason that she was able to get enough shares to control the company for that price is because it was probably going to go out of business. It was in debt up to its eyeballs. The staff had been undergone round after round after round of firings. The idea that like she just took this healthy company and killed it is wrong. She took a sick company, she got it back up on its feet and got it to walk for another 12 years before, yes, bad decisions she made did lead to its death. But again, to say simply that Lorraine bad, Gary good is really simplistic, especially when you consider that the Williams era really is the silver age of D&D. So something special went on there. The creation of all those different worlds, worlds that we still pine for today and hope. Is Wizards going to finally put out Dragonlance? Oh, they are! Oh my God, this is amazing. Are we going to get Dark Sun before 5th edition ends? I don't know. And again, they've tried to introduce new settings with 5th edition, but back in the 90s, you'd get the setting, you would get a series of adventures, you'd probably get a series of novels, and that kind of support. They just don't do it anymore. So it really was a special era to live through. I mean, Dark Sun, it gets support akin to what Star Wars kind of gets today in terms of novelizations and things like that. And it's a minor game world from TSR. Again, you have tens of thousands of people to this day that are still dedicated at Dark Sun. I had a guy email me yesterday asking if I just knew of a history of Dark Sun anywhere because he was so interested in reading a history of Dark Sun. So you also have to put that on the Williams side of the ledger, that she allowed the creation of all these game worlds. Now, also, probably the creation of all those game worlds was a financial disaster for the company and partly drove it into the ground. It's probably one of the reasons that the company died. It's also why you really never see companies do this anymore. Like
it's interesting. No, it's interesting you say that because I had this down as one of the key takeaways from your book for me. Because one thing I've been, and maybe this puts me in the Williams camp. One of the things I've been trumpeting for ages in the OSR space is that people just keep putting out rule sets after rule sets after rule sets, and I've started to take the viewpoint of I'm done buying rules. I say that, but I buy freaking everything that comes out. It's ridiculous. But anyway, I say I'm done buying rules. I want people to put out more settings. Like, where are all the cool settings? Where, if we live in an age where anybody can publish anything so easily, and there are so many creative and talented people, why isn't there a new Dark Sun? Why isn't there these things coming out all the time? And maybe after I was going through your book and you got to that part where you're like, maybe the settings are what actually sunk all this. I was like, ooh, maybe that's why Necrotic Gnome and them aren't, or why other companies aren't pumping out a bunch of settings, is because for those same reasons. But from a fan or a consumer perspective, I view those settings completely differently. I view it as like, oh, give me more of those. But I can completely see where you're coming from in terms of like looking at the numbers. I don't know if that's a case of the market at that point. Would those market conditions still apply today? But I can see where you're coming from with the data that you had there.
I would also say, so this is a pet theory that I'm trying to refine and have not succeeded yet. Role-playing games seem to go through some sort of a life cycle where there's an early and vital period where you can create things and add things to the game, and then eventually it ossifies and calcifies, and the game becomes this set thing in people's minds, and it becomes very hard to make radical alterations to it. And I feel like the TSR era was the end of the creative period for D&D. And, like, again, you only got one new setting with 3rd edition, Eberron. And again, 5th edition, they've tried new things, but it's always just one book,
yeah,
and that's it. And, like, when I think about OSR, like, you're right, like, Dungeon Crawl Classics occasionally put something out. But again, it's usually a one-off, and then that's it, right?
Yeah. And I mean, depending on who you're talking to in the OSR space, you'll have people who will claim whether or not Crawl Classics even is an OSR game, right?
Yeah.
Or is this one, is that one? But yeah, like the number of settings is much smaller, and they're often tied to the rule set specifically. So you look at something like Hyperborea, really great rule set, basically, a reskin 2E or 1E, but very flavorful from its setting, and you won't see a different setting come out for that game, just because it's so tied into what it is. And even on you take what is arguably probably the most popular OSR game right now, being Old School Essentials, until Gavin finally goes and publishes Dolmenwood here sometime in the next year or two. Your settings are just the TSR settings. There's nobody coming out with additional settings for that. So that was always one of my little flags. People make more settings, and I've talked to like folks like Ed Greenwood about it and stuff, about why he doesn't think there's more, or why there isn't like a open source crowd created Harn world or something along those lines. And yeah, it's an interesting discussion. But I want to circle back to Lorraine for a minute, because like I said, a lot of people villainize who she is, and you I think handled it very fairly. Like, you were very open about the things that she did good, and what you think may lay at her feet. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to speak with you, or was unwilling to speak with you for the book, which I think would have been a huge change in how the whole thing was perceived. But since the book's come out, because I'm sure whenever you first reached out to her, she's probably gotten, over the decades, just tons of D&D fans that are just completely biased against her from the get-go. It's almost a poison pill before she even sits down and talk to them. But after your book has come out, I don't know if you've heard from her. Has she read do you know if she's read the book, or has there been any communication where maybe you might be able to have an interview or an honest discussion now after she sees where you're coming from?
I doubt it. Again, like, to my mind, she's got to be, in her 70s somewhere now, probably. Maybe only her 60s, but still, she's very wealthy. And also, again, she never actually cared about any of this.
Yeah, I mean, that was always kind of the thing with her, was that she wasn't a gamer to begin with, so maybe. Maybe this is just a chapter of her life where there was a business ahead, but I'd be interested to know if she has the same nostalgic for it that everybody kind of else does. Like,
like, her brother wrote a very nice review of it on Amazon. I'm like, okay, that's good. Like, if her brother read it and liked it enough that he goes and reviews it on Amazon, that would seem to indicate that at least at family dinners, if they ever see each other, he's like, hey, maybe you should have considered doing this thing. But again, I also want to talk to her extensively about what I assume to be the greatest failure of her life. I could be wrong, but her company failed. She had to sell it to someone she perceived as an enemy, and it probably became clear to her afterwards that many of the people that she might have considered friends just listened to her because she was the boss and actually wanted nothing to do with her, which I don't know what your experience is with wealthy, rich bosses, but again, they seem to really confuse sometimes employees with friends, and struggle to have actual meaningful relationships. And wouldn't surprise me if Lorraine was in that camp. But yeah, I'm certainly not writing it off. Maybe if I get a really good review somewhere, I'll send it to her sometime. Because I have her email address, but I don't want to bug her. But I would certainly I'd love that interview. Assuming she's in Chicago, which I think she is, I'd love to drive down and talk to her for a couple hours and see what I could get out of her.
I mean, for as much of a failure as it was, at least she managed to walk away still holding on to Buck Rogers, right? So,
pour that salt in the wound there, Kevin.
So one of the things I found interesting, just looking things up on you too, and of other interviews I've done with a bunch of other folks in the RPG space, and I was wondering if you saw the same correlation as all the different interviews that you were doing, is that there seems to be a big correlation between people who are in the education field, teachers or educators of some sort, and those who get heavily involved in the RPG scene. I've noticed that just from the interviews I've been doing on the podcast. You yourself were a teacher at some point. As you were going through the interviews, did you find that as well? That there was like did you find a large amount of people from academia, or is that just me pulling a correlation that maybe doesn't actually exist?
I mean, I think there's a correlation there, but I not so much on the professional side. At least I should say for TSR back in the day, because everyone I interviewed pretty much was a game designer. There were a few people that were in teaching.
Oh, I think we may have just lost Ben. His audio has gone here.
Uh-oh. Check 1 2 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Can you hear me?
Yep, you just came back.
Okay, weird. So back in, I think that like now there's probably a correlation between teaching and gaming, just because teachers at least have the summers and have some regular breaks, and that certainly helps. I also find there's a lot of computer people in the role-playing game space, because they seem to have at least money, so they can take some time off, go to Gen Con, throw money at the hobby, things like that. So yeah, I do think that it is funny that the hobby kind of started as a hobby for smart poor people, and it still can be a hobby for smart poor people, specifically smart poor people far from major metropolitan centers. I don't know how you feel an hour outside of Toronto.
I grew up in the smallest, most isolated spot that you could think of. So I grew up very far away from where I live now.
Okay.
So I would fall into the far away from a major urban center standpoint.
Were you in Ontario?
No, I lived on the far east coast of Canada on a little tiny province called Prince Edward Island. It's a population.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Oh, have you been there? Okay,
Right.
yeah. So it's a tiny spot. That's where I grew up,
Yeah.
and very much different from Toronto.
What's the name of the city?
Charlottetown?
Yeah, in Charlottetown or no?
No, in the other city on the island summer side. There's only two, and they're barely cities for anybody who isn't aware.
Charlottetown is so nice.
They are. They're beautiful. It's fantastic. I go back for about a month or so every year. But yeah, it's a very different pace of life as opposed to if you live anywhere else, probably in Canada, really.
Yeah. Now, I'm a thing I stick to is like the gaming stores in Milwaukee, Wisconsin are better than the gaming stores in New York City or Los Angeles, California. I mean, we have like 3 or 4, and all of them are superior to every game store in New York City and Los Angeles, California. Perhaps the only things that you can point to and be like, yeah, we do that better than New York and Cali. Because again, there's just something about being far away from what seems to be the blinding pulse of culture. It's the weekend and maybe there's just not much to do. So, well, you know what you can do? You can play D&D. That is what you can do with your mind and all this free time you have as a kid. So it is kind of funny to think that now having money in the hobby is a bit of an advantage, but maybe not when you're growing up. Now I'm rambling. I'm sorry. I'll stop.
Oh, no worries. I was going to say the other thing I've found as I've been doing interviews here with folks in the RPG space is how willing it is for everybody to talk. I've very rarely had somebody come back and say, no, I don't want to do an interview. Everybody seems to be pretty eager to talk about the things that they enjoy, which I mean you would expect, right? People want to talk about the stuff that they like. Did you find that as you're trying to source people for Lorraine aside, but trying to find people from the TSR era, or was there some resistance due to maybe the hard feelings about how things went down at that point, or were most people very happy to sit down and give you their time?
Most people were pretty eager to talk because the story they had to tell was, I was brilliant and my boss effed it all up. and really, who does not love telling that story?
True.
But I will say, I've begun working on a book 2, and that is already a much different process. Like I'll interview people, and most of them I can kind of see editing themselves as they talk to me. In book 1, I'd be like, tell me about the creation of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition, and boom, out comes a story. And this time it's like, okay, tell me about Fourth Edition. Long pause. Let me think. What's not going to get me in trouble? So I'm working on a volume 2, but I am concerned that maybe the
Won't be
old
as
deck
candid.
is not going to be there. Yeah, maybe because when people talk to me for book 1, it was I'm just some journalist who's theoretically writing a thing. But now it's like, oh, this is probably going to be in Barnes and Noble at some point. So what am I going to say here? What am I going to say?
Right.
It could also just be that I've moved forward in time a little bit from talking about things in the 80s and 90s to the noughties, and it's just sooner, so people might have conflicted feelings about talking about those things. But that's the big change I saw in interviews, is from book 1 to book 2, things seem to have changed.
And as you're getting these stories, so you're getting tons of little anecdotes, so I'm sure you had to do a certain amount of, is that reality or is that just your nostalgia or your, whatever colored glasses view of what happened. But were there stories that really shocked you that came out of there? Because when I went through the settings, like I mentioned, was one that I went, oh, wow, like that kind of changed my view on things a little bit. I kind of had a little bit of a tear in my eye as you were talking about the storage locker that got basically trashed with probably priceless artifacts sitting in there. And of course the publisher deal, which I had never heard of until I listened to the book. But outside of, say, those things, which everybody should go and listen to the book or read the book for those things is just on their own. But were there other like really cool stories that you had never heard of or just shocked you or changed your perception of things?
I was shocked that they turned down the chance to do a Lord of the Rings role-playing game. And again, like, that's very hindsight is 2020. Like in 1991, 1992, Lord of the Rings was not what it is today.
Right.
But it would have been really cool to see what they would have done with that. And I got to talk to John Ratliff, who actually flew to England and talked to Christopher Tolkien about this, and he kind of told me the whole story. That really shocked me. Also, TSR West blew my socks.
Comic book. Yeah, sorry, not the comic books.
Yeah.
They were comic modules, or
Yeah.
is that how they were labeled?
Yeah. So it was the early 90s, and comic book companies were hot, and TSR was like, let's start a comic book company. So they tried to start a comic book company in Los Angeles, California. And I had no idea that they did this. My editor really questioned, do we really need this in here? And I'm like, no one knows this story. And he's like, what does it really have to do with how they failed? And I'm like, well, it lost them money. And again, I just had no idea that they went all in on making comic books, that there was like a year where TSR published like 6-7 comic book lines.
Yeah, I have to jump on eBay at some point and take a look, see if any of these exist, because I'd be interested to because I've never seen them even mentioned on like you'll see like troves of old PDFs like of Dungeon magazine and what have you of that era. I've never seen one of these comic books, I don't think, or comic modules.
They are not cheap, or rather they are cheap. They're cheap, and they are not hard to find because nobody really wants them. So you can $50 will probably get you the entire line. Again, I think I spent like 25, and I was like, I think I bought the first 2 or 3 of everything, and then maybe all of 1 or 2 entire lines. But some of them were good, some of them were terrible. But again, it's just so weird that TSR had a comic book company and spent all of this money. They recruited comic book professionals. People moved from New York to LA to work for TSR on their comic books. And then it was all gone. And they were left with nothing but balance sheets in the red. Again, I had vague recollections of it, but I did not know the story the way it was told to me. I didn't know, like, they went to war with DC Comics essentially in order to do this. They alienated DC Comics and had nothing to show for it. So that's probably the next most shocking thing to me.
I thought it was interesting that one area that you didn't really go too deep on, or I can't even remember if it was really mentioned much more than a passing, but was the Dragon and Dungeon magazines and the role that they played with TSR. Because I have to assume, for the most part, that was a fairly stable position in the company.
That is accurate. As far like the circulation numbers in Dungeon and Dragon had to be published once a year in the magazine by law for some reason. So you can go and you can look at the subscribership. It's pretty constant for both. Neither was a huge windfall for TSR, but neither was a huge money sink either. So I almost never talk about it just because it would have been, well, here's a bunch about Dungeon and Dragon, but it really didn't have anything to do with the collapse of the company because they did fine.
Yeah. Were there other things that you had like researched or written up that maybe during the editorial process kind of got dropped away that you kind of wish was still in there?
12,000 words on third edition, but I'll just put that in the next book.
Very good. I got to assume then the next book, if you're willing to mention anything about it, has got to be, what Wizards of the Coast did with the product. And third edition, is there going to be a mentions of Paizo and the rise of that, or?
I'm thinking right now the through line for book 2 is going to be the open gaming license.
You're stealing my questions ahead of time. Continue.
Sorry. Yeah, like even before the recent kerfuffle, I was like, okay, other people sit down and they're like, I'm just writing a history of Dungeons and Dragons, and I always am like, I have some sort of a question. And when I was thinking about like Wizards of the Coast, I was like, the open gaming license has to be the framing question about the next 20 years of D&D. Because here Wizards of the Coast is doing this shocking, radical thing, essentially giving away their IP. And how it worked out for Wizards is very complicated. Like, it's not a very clear-cut, the OGL has clearly been a huge benefit for Wizards of the Coast. Now, I think it has been a huge benefit for Wizards of the Coast, but it certainly is not a simple story of, obviously this has been great. So the OGL is my lens, and if the OGL is my lens, I have to talk about Paizo. I have to talk about some third-party publishers, Paizo being the most essential of them, just because they're the biggest. Even then, Paizo, I think, is probably a tenth the size of the D&D market.
Yeah. At this point in time, essentially. I mean, yeah. At their height, obviously, you can make a different argument on that, but at this point in time, yeah, they've got to be.
Yeah. And again, with the recent scandal, suddenly the OGL has become very very hot, very apropos. So I feel like for 17 years I didn't have much luck, and now I feel like I keep getting lucky left, right, and center. I need to start buying lottery tickets.
So at the end of your book, the book takes us to the point where Wizards of the Coast has acquired the company, and we see the end of TSR, and Peter Atkinson is kind of presented very much as a knight in shining armor, the hero of the story. He came in, he saved the company, and we are where we are today. I assume with you doing the research for book 2 and just mentioning the most recent kerfuffle, do you think that there is a difference between the Wizards of the Coast of the time when Peter ran the show and purchased the company to Wizards of the Coast today?
Oh yeah,
and Hasbro essentially controlling the IP. Is there, because I think sometimes people don't really differentiate it, right? They see Wizards of the Coast as a through line throughout, and it's the same thing. And I think there is definitely eras of Wizards of the Coast that, depends on how much you want to vilify them, that's got to change a little bit along the way, right?
So I would say a couple things. I would say, number one, my sources tell me that you should now just consider Wizards of the Coast to be Hasbro.
Right.
Since the CEO of Hasbro is a former CEO of Wizards of the Coast, there's very little sunlight between those two organizations now. From Peter's time, There's really almost no one left, especially not anyone in power. Like Chris Perkins and Mike Merles had some 3.5 credits, I want to say. I think on the 3.5 core books, both Chris Perkins and Mike Merles did work. Chris Perkins is still in the is he brand manager for D&D now? I'd have
I'm
to
not
look
sure.
it up.
I'm not sure what his title is,
Yeah.
but he's on the creatives. He's one of the top folks on the creative side.
Yeah, he clearly is, D&D for life. That's which is fine. Mike Merles is still at the company, but he's over in Magic the Gathering now. So there's very little. And oh shoot, what's his name? Not Chris Lindsay, not Chris Perkins, Steve Winter. Steve Winter, who was hired at TSR in like 1982, will still do work on the occasional D&D product. But I think he might have had the longest career in actual brand Dungeons and Dragons of anyone ever. Like he has to be having his like 40th anniversary of writing D&D products around now. So yeah, it's fair to say that Wizards of the Coast is no longer what Peter Adkison made it, and again, a lot of that sunny-eyed West Coast optimism, we're going to do things differently, seems to have been replaced by just corporate math. I feel like I only half answered your question, and I can't remember the other half of it.
Well, it was more about, I guess, to use a phrase that history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Was there mistakes that happened as you had the initial era of TSR under Gary, and then it moved into a larger buyout and owning by Williams, and then you've got the early days of being controlled by Peter and the Wizards of the Coast of that era, and now it's Hasbro. Is there mistakes that you saw from then that's kind of repeating now? Is there a parallel that you could kind of draw through that?
I would say that the core issue is when the people making decisions about D&D are not really D&D gamers, things get complicated. 2, I am not a financial guy. I'm not a business guy. I do my best when I write about it, and I make up for it in research. My understanding is Hasbro needs to be making more money. My understanding is there's a debt situation there, and when people get in debt and suddenly need D&D to make more money for them, it seems to go poorly, because role-playing games are a really weird business where people love them. They dedicate their lives to them. They can be all-consuming, just like comic books or Star Wars. And yet, if you spend $100 to $150 on rule books, you could be good for the rest of your life. And what do we need Wizards of the Coast for? And at TSR, they were like, okay, we're going to monetize players by making fiction, which is a pretty good idea. And we're going to monetize players by putting out books that we think players will like. And we got that complete guide to line of books, which was also pretty cool. Again, it's the idea that you want to monetize players by giving them good products is not really a terrible idea, although where do you go with it now? Like, are you going to really make the Ultimate Guide to Fighters for 5th edition? You can do it. It's just been done so many times. But I honestly think that the growth of D&D has not been driven by players. And the idea to monetize players, I think, is missing the boat. I think that what you want to do, if you want to make D&D the most successful it's ever been and make it and have it make more money than it's ever made before, what you want to do is make D&D ridiculously easy for a dungeon master to run. Ridiculously easy. That is your number one task, because you will encourage people to run the game. They will go and find 5 or 6 other people. Now, maybe only 1 or 2 of them buy a rule book. But you know what? They're more prone to go see that D&D movie. We have increased the value of your brand. And I think that is what D&D actually is. I think I might even be paraphrasing Ryan Dancy here. It's an attention engine, and it's a culture, and it's a community, and you can monetize that community by giving it cool stuff. But the community will also rebel against you if it feels that it's being patronized or catered to or abused, because ultimately we don't need to buy anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said it really well, in that once you've bought, I mean, in the OSR sphere, everybody likes to talk about, what's the one book. If you're going to take that one book, you're stuck on a desert island. What's the only book you're going to take? Oftentimes, people are going to mention the Rule Cyclopedia. Everybody else has different ones. Rule Cyclopedia, I think, is a great choice. I would probably stick with BX. It's 2 books, but I'm going to put them in the same binder, so it's all good. But it's and you can do that and play for the rest of your life, and you don't need to buy anything else. I really do agree with you that you need to focus on the DMs, because one thing I feel that's been kind of lost in the newest era of D&D is having somebody take somebody and teach them how to play the game. People are learning now instead of by watching a performance of the game, but they don't have the next door neighbor saying, "Hey, come over here. I got this cool thing I need to show you. We're going to sit down and we're going to learn it that way." Instead, people are discovering it via a stream, which is a completely valid way of doing it. I'm not knocking on streams, but it's a very different one. I think it produces a different expectation and a different attachment to the game than having your next door neighbor or your buddy or your older sibling or what have you teaching it to you in that way. And I mean,
go ahead, sorry.
So I was going to say, I've heard all the reports of people saying, "Hey, there's a DM shortage in 5e as well," which I think is to its downfall. Although 5e arguably is the most successful version of the game that's ever been created. So maybe I'm just way off on that too. But
I will tell you what I have heard through back channels is that 3 million players' handbooks have been sold for 5e. If that is true, that means that there were more players' handbooks sold for 5e than if you took all of first edition and all of second edition and all of second edition revised and put them in one pile. There is a bigger pile of all the 5th edition players' handbooks.
The thing I want to know about the one area of 5th edition players that I'm curious about is what the drop-off rate is. What is the rate of, "Hey, I saw something cool on a Twitch stream," or I heard of something neat. I went and I grabbed it because it's easy to, you can go on Amazon, one click, you're done. You don't even need to go to a store. And then how often after that is it just forgotten about? When my favorite streams got away, they don't do their thing anymore. I've now moved on, or I got tired, or I don't have time to do this. As opposed to, I don't want to say quote unquote true fans, but just it feels like there's been a lot more retention with some of the older editions of fans, or maybe it's just simply, maybe that's a survivor bias of looking back and saying, "Look at all these people from previous ones," and I'm not seeing the ones that dropped off either. But I feel like there's a difference there, and I don't know exactly how to word that properly. But
I don't know. I mean, there are 4 or 5 women under 30 at my school that play D&D, and they're pretty ferocious about 5th edition. And again, I have no doubt that when they're 20 years from now, whatever edition of when they're complaining about 8th edition, they're going to be like, "Well, 5th edition was the greatest edition of all time." I do think it.
I actually,
I'll go to war for 2nd. I really like 2nd edition.
I had that exact conversation when the first rumblings of 6th edition or 1D&D or D&D 1 or whatever it's called started coming about. I was like, all these 5th edition players who have been like boohooing OSR players saying, "Oh, give up the past. Why are you hanging on to all this old stuff?" I'm like, you wait, your time's coming. There will be more editions, and you will pine for what you had before. But we touched on the OGL situation, and you wrote a really cool article on Gizmodo a bit ago about this. What do you feel, or how do you feel about how it got leaked out, and then the PR laundry machine that has been going on like crazy. Like I feel for Kyle Brinks, like he's got a job that I don't think anybody really wants right now, trying to paper over all of this. But do you feel, or from the people that you've talked to, and I don't want to scoop on your book, but is the view that most of us have of like, you guys are lying through your teeth, this is what you're actually trying to do, versus what Kyle is now going out and trying to say, oh no, it was a mistake, we didn't know. Like, what's your view on all that?
I think there's a couple things. I think one is that Wizards of the Coast is not a monolith. Even though I am like, there's no space between them and Hasbro. When Kyle is talking about his experience with the OGL debacle, he says that the day that awful patronizing press release came out, that was like, we all won. That was the day he was like, I need to step up and take a bigger role here. Again, I will tell you that confidential sources have told me that higher ups at Wizards really looked at a lot of third-party Kickstarters, and they were like, that's our money. That's our money that is on the table, and we need to get that money. Which again, if you have a business background, and you're like, why did we give away our intellectual property? It's not a crazy instinct. It's not a good one for our community, and it's not a good one for the brand.
But if you're an MBA, it makes sense.
Yeah. And I do wish that they just came out and kind of said that, because it did force Kyle to say a lot of things that just didn't make a ton of sense. Again, I don't find that PR or marketing is typically, the dark art of lying. It's the art of massaging.
It's the art of framing things.
And shining light and water on certain truths and trying to make sure others withered. Yeah. And I would tell you that what I've taken, I am doing research on this now. Again, I don't know that my book is actually going to cover it in any great depth, but I've got another article I think that'll be coming out in a couple weeks, where I went and I talked, because a big part of the story is Kyle saying, this is what we did with the third-party publishers. And I was like, oh, really? I'm just going to go talk to some third-party publishers and see what they'll say. And they were pretty frank. They did sign NDAs, so they were very concerned about making sure that they did not step on those NDAs, because nobody wants an NDA fight with Wizards.
Yeah.
But, there were, again, I wrote an article about this, so I don't want to say too much, because in the article I was very careful about, because people would move on and off the record. Like, oh, I shouldn't say that because of the NDA. And again, some of it was very anodyne stuff. Like, I don't want to say what restaurant we ate at because of the NDA. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's fine.
Well, because that would identify who they are, right? Like, it's people trying to make sure that there is no way of. I mean, there was even, I remember people being concerned about, well, why aren't more people leaking the contracts out? And they were saying, well, because the contracts might not be the same, identical between each of these different publishers, right? So nobody wanted to leak in case there was something identifiable in the language.
Well, again, like, I think that I don't know who leaked the initial contract, but I would almost for sure guarantee it was someone under the age of 30. That is the only prediction I would make about who leaked the contract, because again, I just don't think if you own a multi-million-dollar corporation, you're not gonna risk all of that on a public fight with Wizards. Furthermore, like, every corporation I spoke to about their negotiations with Wizards kept those contracts to a very small number of people. And again, I've heard a lot of accusations, about who did it, but that's the only one I'm comfortable putting any sort of like, yeah, I'd put money on that. It's someone under 30.
So going back to the whole like history doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes. If you were a betting person or a guessing person, and you're looking at what's happened here, and you saw as you're going through your own research, you saw the rise of Paizo and the decline of Wizards of the Coast branded D&D during the fourth edition era, and we're kind of in this here now. And there was a lot of people saying, "Hey, the trust and everything that's been kind of spooked up by this," and you're seeing, Paizo. I bet you Paizo sold more books in the first quarter of this year than they have in the last 2 years. Kobold Press is doing their thing. Do you think we're kind of primed for maybe not a full scale repeat, but maybe a similar type trajectory change, or is this something that you think they're going to be able to ride out of and come back with everybody forgetting about this in the quarter?
It's really hard to follow up a good edition of D&D. It's really hard. Like the thing I've been told about fourth edition so far is that
your video is frozen and we've lost the audio, so I'm going to fill in the gap here a little bit while we wait to see if it reconnects. Oh, you're moving again.
Check 1 2 check 1 2. Can you hear me?
Yep. Sorry.
That's okay. Your question was, do you think that the next edition is going to lead to a rise of a third-party challenge to D&D?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really hard to come after a good edition of D&D. The fourth edition designers, the story they're kind of telling me so far is that they were handcuffed by upper management and business people telling them what the game was supposed to be. And that like a lot of the bad decisions were not made by them and were forced on them. Now I have to go and interview those people who like.
It wasn't me. It was my boss. I was a creative genius. So it's the same as the first book, right?
Yeah, I'll chase down the boss and be like, "Hey, boss, like, is that true?" And hopefully they'll talk to me. Fifth edition, I think, is probably the D&D primed to be the most popular game it can be in the 21st century. I think that I would not want to be the person tasked with doing the next thing. I think it was really smart when they were like, one D&D is not a new edition. It's like the final form of 5th edition. I mean, that's good marketing. If that's true, maybe they've learned and they're like, okay, this is just like an update for 5th edition, and the core is really going to be the same. And you can kind of see that happening. And I think if they tread lightly, and don't make so many changes and again, they said it's going to be backwards compatible. But I'm trying to think, like, Call of Cthulhu is a good example here. The 7th edition of Call of Cthulhu is really, really good. But it was also designed so that you can pick up any Call of Cthulhu supplement ever, and you can run it with the 7th edition rules. If that is what the next edition of D&D is going to be, it's going to be so backwards compatible that you can run any 5th edition product with it, and it just buffs a few things and changes a few things. Again, one thing I heard someone object to was the 8-hour rest rule was broken and everyone's just napping in dungeons, and that needs to be fixed. Maybe they fix that, and you're like, oh, it is legitimately a better game. I think that wouldn't present an opportunity for a new Paizo to emerge. If, however, it is very different and bad, then yeah, it could happen. That's a little unfair because that infers that 4th edition I don't think was bad. It was just
I think I agree. I don't think it was so much that it was bad. It was a shift of what people wanted to do, and I wonder if, rather than being from a rule standpoint, the mistake possibly, or maybe it'll be the boon, but possibly the mistake with this will be that it's the plan to make it as digital as possible. Let's make this as much as we can bound to D&D Beyond. I wonder if that will be the negative or the downfall of it, as opposed to the rule set itself. I think that because for all the reasons you just said, they've been very public saying they want to make it backwards compatible. I really question how much they can do that if they still actually want to sell new books. Because let's be honest, 90% of the time that you're putting out a new edition is because you want to sell more players' handbooks, and if it's the exact same player's handbook, who's going to buy it, right? But I wonder if the potential Achilles heel may be the digital side of it. Although, most of us are playing our games online and what have you now.
Yeah, could be. I mean, I think the problem is they didn't get there first, and that we already have digital tools doing it. So now you're convincing us to leave our current digital tools. And again, maybe what they make is so cool and so hot that we all run to give them $10 a month, and I would be happy with that. Again, like I do not per se. I'm not sitting here being like all digital tools for D&D are bad. I'm just like, well, if you're gonna try and force bad ones down our throat in some way, that's not going to go great. But again, I would hope that their plan is, again, we're just going to make such a shit hot virtual tabletop that you have to come get it. I don't know. Like, I can't think of a time when someone has been like an also ran, like, oh my God, Facebook's a hit. I'm going to make the next Facebook and just do what Facebook does better. Never seems to matter. People will endure the badness of the thing they know rather than bothering to learn a new thing that does the same thing better. So I would tell them, I don't know that that's a winning strategy. I think you're going to spend a ton of money for not much success. I think that, again, if I had their ear, I would tell them, okay, you should put out 12 free adventures for D&D. They should be amazing, and you should hire amazing designers with amazing graphic artists, plus some layout people from the OSR, and they should be free, and watch what happens to your sales. And you should have maps that come with them. They should all be printable maps that are in full color or black and white, and you put out an advertising campaign in support of these free products and watch what happens. Because I think that is actually where their money is, and how and you make virtual tabletop support for all of them, for the Foundry and Roll20 and all this stuff that already exists.
I'm really interested to see what they do for the 50th anniversary. Like, are they going to acknowledge the past and celebrate the past, or will it be all forward facing? And I think they could, especially after the OGL situation, I think they could win a bunch of goodwill back if they were able to properly acknowledge and celebrate the past as well as the future on it. I'm interested to see what they do with that. I'm not expecting much, and in the end, it overly doesn't matter to me whether they themselves do, but I think it would be a good move on their part to do that, to acknowledge and celebrate the past, with that, and not in the way that they have taken heat for celebrating the past in the past, like with the Thaco clown thing and all that. I mean, doing it in a respectful and proper way, maybe a little better.
Well, again, it's so curious that D&D is fundamentally the creation of people rejected by American society in almost every way they could be. Gary Gygax was unemployed. He was a religious minority, a member of a very weird religion, but still, I'm sure he felt like he was cut out of the religious life of America. He was cut out of the economic life of America. He's living in a resort town that 8 months out of the year is economically dead. He's feeding his children welfare cheese, and Ernie Gygax is putting cardboard in his shoes because there's holes in them. And that guy creates this game that with Dave Arneson, of course, who has a similar story, but it's radical, revolutionary, new. It's a new medium. It's like acting was invented in 1974 in Wisconsin, and here we are 50 years later. And it has gone from, a Lake Geneva basement to East Coast and West Coast corporate boardrooms of billion-dollar corporations, and you have MBAs trying to figure out what to do with this game. And I would certainly say that the most successful moments have been when those MBAs are huge D&D nerds. So again, I certainly have concerns about the future of the game. I don't know that Wizards knows what to do with it. I think that Wizards had a plan, but the OGL debacle has to have put everything on hold. And again, they know they have a problem. That's why they're flying all these influencers out to their headquarters on April 3rd, which is, again, not a bad idea. And again, Kyle Brink, I don't think he's doing a terrible job trying to put lipstick on this pig. Clearly there are still good people there, but I'm going to buy an extra 5th edition Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monsters Manual before all of this goes to hell, because I'm like, I think this will be worth something someday. Not enough to retire on, but
yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of them out there, but it'll be a nice little artifact. Yeah. All right, I got a couple last questions for you.
Go for it.
So, one, of all the people that you talked to through all that, through all the research and the emails and I'm sure video conferences like this one, who is the character that most sticks out in your mind where you're like, I would love to sit down and have a beer with this person? Like if I got a chance to sit down and just chill out and chat with this person, who was the character that stood out to you the most that way?
I'm going to go Flint Dilley.
Oh, really?
Oh,
We're going to California.
Oh, yeah. Flint Dilley, Lorraine's brother. He has been hired by both George Lucas and Steven Spielberg to write. He wrote American Tail 2, Fievel Goes West. He is a character. He is larger than life. He said, when I sent him a draft of my book, he said, I see what you did. You made me into a character. I'm like, I didn't need to do anything. I just needed to describe you and list what you said, and you become that character, sir. Like, your best friend is Frank Miller. Flint from G.I. Joe is apparently named after you. The narrator character from 300 is apparently named after you. The guy in 300 even looks like you in the drawings of Frank Miller. Like, that's got just a fascinating dude.
The next question I got for you is, much like what we're doing right now, you've had a podcast, Plot Points. It's on hiatus, is it coming back? Is there new episodes of Plot Points?
I'm pleased to say I got an episode up 10 days ago.
Oh, okay.
First one since July. So I'm hoping to get back on a regular, 2 or 3 episodes a month kick. Right now, I'm reading the Dungeon Master's Guide aloud with a guy who's going to essentially get a doctorate in Appendix N from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the spring. And I've never read it before. I know a lot about the production of the first edition DMG, and a lot of what was going on at TSR at the time. And he knows a lot about the influences of it. So it's a fun time. I think we have literally 24 hours of us of reading the Dungeon Master's Guide aloud. We're averaging like a page an hour because of all the discussion. So hopefully people find that interesting and come check it out if you haven't listened to it. Plot Points.
Awesome. Yeah, it's going through and deciphering high Gygax at a time can be fun. But and my last question for you is, you've obviously you've done the press tour for the book, and you've done your own podcasts, and you have people asking you questions all the time. What is something that I haven't asked you, or that you don't get asked about enough, that you wish somebody would? Like, what's something that I should have asked you about that would have been a cool thing to hear about that I didn't ask? Or what are things that you wish people would talk about more that you do, or that you're involved in, that just nobody ever brings up?
Good question. This has been a pretty good interview, so I'm struggling actually to come up with an answer.
Or if I've totally stumped you and blindsided you like I do with a lot of people, feel free just to go off on something about you that people don't normally know about.
See, I taught in Egypt for a year. I was able to see the pyramids from my classroom.
So what's your theory on how they were built?
I think the accepted theory makes the most sense.
Aliens? Totally.
I'm going to go no on that one. But what do I wish people? I guess I will quickly throw out there that one of the fascinating things about the D&D hobby, if Wizards of the Coast marketing is to be believed, is that it is almost perfectly evenly spread across demographics. Something like a quarter of the players are under 18, a quarter are like 18 to 40, another quarter are 40 to 60, and then I think there's even another 25. And again, I'm making these numbers up, but yeah, like I can't think of almost anything in America that has that even a spread of demographics. I want to say it's almost perfectly balanced by gender now. It keeps getting more racially diverse. And in a time when it seems like new technology is constantly tugging at us and pulling us away from each other, D&D seems to be one of the few things that's actually bringing us together. And whenever someone gets into D&D, oh my God, if they play it for a year, they'll play it for life. It bonds you with people. I recently started playing 3.5 with 4 men in their 40s and 2 women under 30. And none of us, I played a little 3.5, but I'm running it because of my book. I'm like, okay, I'll run 3.5 because I have to run 3.5 because I need to know it for my book. And when the first time I had women under 30 at the table, it was a bit like a middle school dance.
They all stayed on one side, and you guys all stayed
those
on
of
the
us who are male in our 40s are kind of like, what do we do? What do we say to the women under 30? And again, we're all attached. It's not like this is a dating situation. But 2 or 3 sessions in, suddenly everybody's talking. Everybody's comfortable. There's already inside jokes. And, these people from another generation that maybe we only have D&D in common, but suddenly we have something in common that we can talk about, and there's a little community that forms. And I would say that is a remarkable thing about the hobby of Dungeons and Dragons in the 21st century.
I think that's an awesome point to call it. I think also, and I would say definitely it wasn't as even of a demographic spread as what Wizards is saying it is now, but even back, I know D&D from 70s 80s era gets looked at as like it was all just old white guys, or now old white guys that were playing in the basement, but it was a much more diverse game than it gets credit for as well. And I think that needs to be reminded to folks as well, is that when people were playing, you couldn't be picky about who you wanted to play with. So you took all comers, because it was, like you said before, it was a game of, the not necessarily the most financially secure or the most popular people that were playing at a given point in time. It was an escapism that, if you found other people that enjoyed it, you took all comers, and whatever demographic they happened to hail from, nobody seemed to really bat an eye. And I think that gets lost a little bit. I think everybody assumes, maybe again because of survivor bias, the people that are still talking about the game from that era maybe are more predominantly old white guys that have big beards, but I don't think that was necessarily exactly always the player base either. Yeah. But I really appreciate you coming on and chatting about this. I really love the book. I thought it was fantastic. Where can people go and find all the things like plot points, your other writings, the book? Where should they go to find all of that?
Oh, what a good question. So the book should be available if you are in North America, at your local bookstore, on Amazon, pretty much anywhere you would go to find a book. It should be available, maybe even your gaming store. I know a few hundred at least were sold into the hobby trade, so you might find it there. Also, Kindle and Audible. If you're in the UK, it is, or in Ireland, it is on Kindle, so you can at least get a reasonably priced digital copy if you're in the UK. Plot points, you can listen to us on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Music. I believe we're on almost every podcast app. Failing that, we're at plotpoints.libsyn.com. I might, maybe I'm ready for Gizmodo now. At least I have one article up on Gizmodo.
Yeah, I was going to ask you too. How did the do you still write for Geek and Sundry? Although I guess Geek and Sundry is now Nerdist,
Yeah,
or
so all my stuff that used to be on Geek and Sundry is now on Nerdist, which sounds more impressive anyway. Um, so I'm fine with I'm fine with that. When I when I have things I can't manage to sell, they'll be on writerbenriggs.com. For example, about 4 months ago, I went over Dave Arneson's letters to Peter Adkison begging to be given a job running D&D.
I've heard about those. I haven't read all. I've read, I think, like the first letter and then the follow-up letter or something. I'm not sure if there was more than that, but yeah,
It was just the two, just those sad two, unfortunately.
yeah, that sounded just sad. I think it's the best way of putting it.
Yeah, so writer Ben Riggs, you'll see things very occasionally, like less than once a month. And then again, my problem is, there's limited. I have a 2-year-old. I have limited full-time job, limited writing time, and it's like book, article. What should I do? I don't know. So I guess Google me if you really want to hunt things that I wrote down. You should be able to find some things.
Good stuff. I'll include links to all those in the description of the episode, obviously. And yeah, I definitely go read if you're interested with the OGL, the Gizmodo article. And we didn't even talk about Encounter Theory, but that's another product you've got out there as well that people should go and check out. Teach you how to make better adventures. But yeah, Ben, thanks so much for coming on. I look forward to the book. Is there a working title for book 2?
I'm calling it right now, and heaven forbid if this sticks, but Slaying the Dragon 2, the descaling.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not going to fly.
Yeah.
The publisher isn't going to allow that.
Sandy Peterson told me you should never give a work a funny title just in case it actually sticks. So I should really stop calling it that.
Good stuff. All right, folks, I'm going to send us the future me to do any editing that we need to do. But Ben, thanks so much for coming on and chatting with me.
My pleasure. Thank you for tolerating my lateness and technical issues.
Not a problem.
So you have a good night.
All right, folks, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Red Caps podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for coming back and listening after a little bit of a break. I really enjoyed my vacation, and it was nice to get away. It's now nice to be back. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you were eager to come back for more. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you ever so much for listening. And remember, never let your caps dry out. Stay safe, have fun. We'll talk again soon.